We have been monitoring the virus situation very closely, and as all of you know, it is spreading very quickly to countries everywhere. And Singapore, as a small, open city connected to the world, we face a higher risk of imported cases. And that's why the task force has decided to take additional precautions for travel in and out of Singapore. For outgoing travelers, we are putting an advisory to defer all non-essential trips to Iran, northern Italy, Japan, and the whole of the Republic of Korea. For incoming travelers, we will not allow visitors who have had recent travel history from Iran, northern Italy, and the Republic of Korea. We have not included Japan in the incoming restrictions because the number of infected cases in Japan at this stage is still lower compared to the other countries. So for Japan, we have placed the advisory. We are managing the risk by having an advisory on outgoing trips at this juncture. Right? So for the incoming visitors, the restrictions are for the 3 places I highlighted. And then for citizens, residents, and long-term pass holders coming back, returning to Singapore, we will issue them a stay-home notice. So these are the new travel restrictions that we are putting in place. In addition, we are putting in place a new screening mechanism at our checkpoints because we know that the temperature scanners alone are not sufficient. So we will now also look out for people with respiratory symptoms, identify them, and request that they take a swab test in order to test whether they are positive for the virus. So those are additional precautions that we are taking both in terms of travel as well as the checks at our borders. I would like to highlight though that despite our very best efforts, we have to be mentally prepared for the number of infected cases in Singapore to go up. We have been used to, I think, the experience so far in these past few days in Singapore where the number of cases rises by just a handful every day. And we've become accustomed to it in a way, but this may not be the norm and it can change very easily. You see this in other countries too, where you have very few cases for a few days and then suddenly one incident occurs, one event occurs, and there is a sharp spike in cases and sustained transmission. This has happened elsewhere. It can happen in Singapore too. Some then ask, if this can happen, then what's the point of having all these restrictions? Well, the answer is that the border controls are still useful at this stage of the epidemic because we can still identify where the sources of risk are, and then we can take appropriate measures to reduce the risk from these infected sources. And by doing so, we flatten the epidemic curve in Singapore, we buy ourselves time, and then we avoid a situation where our hospitals get overwhelmed by a sudden surge of cases. So this is useful, but we have to be prepared that at some stage, the border controls alone will not be sufficient, and we cannot stop the virus at our borders because the virus will spread to countries everywhere around us. And even in countries where they do not report a lot of cases, there may well be undetected cases of virus infections going around. So we will be exposed at that stage to multiple waves of infection, and we have to be ready for that. We cannot stop it from happening, and the only way to stop it is if you were to isolate and shut ourselves out from the world, but I don't think that's a tenable situation. So we have to be prepared that the number of infected cases may go up, which goes back to the earlier point I said, that we have to be mentally prepared that may be new spikes in the number of infection cases here in Singapore, as has happened in other countries. So we do have to redouble our efforts, not just focusing on border controls, but increasingly on what we can do within Singapore itself. And we have been highlighting the need to take all the precautions like maintaining good hand hygiene, upholding higher standards of personal hygiene, as well as public hygiene in common areas, in public areas, in hawker centers, in places that we go to. These are of vital importance. The need for individuals to take responsibility when you are sick, to go and see a doctor quickly and to abide by the doctor's MC and stay at home if you have an MC. I think these are all very important. We should not think that they are good to have. They are of vital importance in order to slow down the spread of the virus in Singapore. So the task force is looking at what other measures we can do to strengthen this aspect of work beyond just looking at border controls, what more we can do within Singapore, and we will be putting out more announcements and details in due course.